John had always prided himself on being a reliable husband. He wasn't one for extravagant gestures, and he knew he wasn't perfect, but for 30 years he had stood by his wife, Jennifer. Together, they had faced life's trials, raising 2 daughters who were now happily married, buying a home, and managing the everyday demands of work and family life. Their marriage had seen its fair share of highs and lows, yet John was certain their bond was strong, unshakable, and built to endure. That belief had shaped his entire world. But recently something felt off. At first, it was almost imperceptible, small, seemingly insignificant changes. Jennifer seemed distracted, her attention often elsewhere. During dinner, she'd drift into her own thoughts or smile at her phone, engrossed in conversations she never shared. She began spending more time out of the house, citing meetings with friends John had never heard of. Then, there was her newfound devotion to the gym. Nearly every day she spent hours working out, a habit she had never shown interest in before. John initially dismissed his unease, attributing it to the natural ebb and flow of a long-term marriage. After all, everyone needed space now and then. But that nagging sense that something was wrong refused to fade. It lingered, clawing at him in quiet moments. One evening, John sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the soft murmur of the television the only sound. It was a scene he had grown accustomed to, waiting for Jennifer to return from yet another late night out. But tonight, the solitude weighed heavier. The clock crept past midnight, and his patience began to fray. His eyes drifted to the mantel, where a framed photo of their family stood, a snapshot from a sun-drenched beach vacation years ago. In it, a younger John smiled proudly, his arms wrapped around Jennifer and their 2 daughters. The image tugged at his heart, a bittersweet reminder of a joy that now felt distant and out of reach. The door finally creaked open well after 1 a.m., and Jennifer walked in. John's heart sank at the sight of her. She looked different, heels clicking softly on the floor, a sleek black dress hugging her figure, her hair styled with precision. The faint scent of cologne, unfamiliar and unmistakably not his, hung in the air, mingling with her perfume. The realization hit John like a blow to the chest. "Hey," he greeted her, his voice strained in an attempt to sound composed, though the crack in his tone betrayed him. "Hi," she murmured, without meeting his gaze, her words rushed and detached. Kicking off her shoes, she moved toward the bedroom with hurried steps, avoiding any interaction. No kiss, no goodnight, not even a passing glance. John remained rooted to the couch, watching her disappear down the hall. Their bed hadn't felt like theirs in months. A storm of unanswered questions churned in his mind. Where had she been? Who had she been with? Was she spending her nights dancing, drinking, or worse, in someone else's arms? The urge to confront her surged within him, but fear held him back. Fear of shattering the fragile normalcy they had managed to maintain. Fear of uncovering a truth he wasn't ready to face. He gripped the armrest of the couch until his knuckles turned white, the tension in the room suffocating. When the bedroom door clicked shut, the emptiness around him became unbearable. Jennifer was only a few steps away, but she might as well have been miles apart. In the weeks that followed, the chasm between them only widened. Their once effortless conversations grew stiff and awkward, reduced to surface-level exchanges. Jennifer's frequent outings became a relentless source of anxiety for John. Her vague excuses left him doubting every word. One evening, as Jennifer prepared for another supposed gym session, John's unease reached its breaking point. He watched her carefully apply makeup and style her hair, an effort that seemed entirely unnecessary for a workout. His stomach twisted with suspicion. When she kissed him goodbye, the gesture felt cold, perfunctory, devoid of any warmth. As soon as the door closed behind her, John's resolve hardened. He couldn't live like this any longer, drowning in uncertainty and doubt. Grabbing his car keys, he left the house with a singular determination: to uncover the truth. He followed her car from a safe distance, his pulse racing with every turn. Eventually, Jennifer pulled into the parking lot of a gym on the other side of town. John parked a block away, careful to remain unseen, and waited. Time dragged painfully as his mind spiraled into darker thoughts. Was she really working out, or was this another elaborate cover? After what felt like hours, the gym door opened and Jennifer emerged. But she wasn't alone. John's heart dropped. She walked arm in arm with a man who looked to be in his late 20s, his casual confidence a sharp contrast to John's growing despair. They laughed together, their body language unmistakably intimate. The way Jennifer gazed at him, with unrestrained warmth and delight, was a look John hadn't seen from her in years. John's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles glowing white under the pale streetlights. Watching Jennifer and the younger man laughing together, so at ease, ignited a storm of anger within him. The intimacy between them was undeniable, and it stung like a betrayal carved into his very being. His rage surged, clouding his thoughts and blurring his vision. He wanted to throw the car door open, march over to them, and demand answers. But something held him back. Maybe it was disbelief. Maybe it was anger so potent it left him paralyzed. Either way, he remained frozen, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Through the window of the bar, Jennifer and the man were wrapped in their private world, oblivious to anything else. John's heart clenched with every smile she gave, every touch she offered. They were gestures that had once been his to treasure. The man leaned in, whispering something that made Jennifer laugh, a sound that had always lit up John's world, but now served as a knife twisting in his chest. She swatted playfully at the younger man, her eyes sparkling with joy. John felt like he was suffocating, yet he couldn't tear his gaze away. When they finally left the bar, well past midnight, John's pulse thundered in his ears. He followed them, keeping a safe distance, each step they took together deepening the fire raging inside him. He clung to a fragile hope that they would part ways, that perhaps he had misread their closeness. But as they approached a nearby hotel, walking hand in hand like carefree lovers, that hope crumbled. John parked a few blocks away, his breath shallow, his chest tight. From the shadow of his car, he watched them stroll into the hotel lobby with the ease of a couple who carried no shame, no secrets. As they disappeared through the revolving doors, John was left staring at the empty entrance, his mind reeling. The simmering rage he had felt earlier now solidified into a cold, seething resolve. This wasn't a fleeting indiscretion. It was deliberate, calculated, and cruel. Sitting there in the silence of his car, John felt the weight of her betrayal settle over him like a suffocating shadow. There was no undoing what had been done. Sleep evaded him that night. He lay awake in bed, his thoughts a relentless cycle of pain and fury. Each time he closed his eyes, images of Jennifer with the other man flooded his mind. Her laugh, her smile, the touch she now gave to someone else. The betrayal festered, an open wound that refused to heal. Sorrow intertwined with anger, feeding a growing hunger for retribution. By the time the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, John's decision was made. He couldn't endure this torment any longer. He would confront her, face her lies head on, and force her to acknowledge the truth. That morning, John was a storm barely contained. He moved through his routine like a man walking on broken glass, each step laced with quiet fury. Jennifer hummed softly as she prepared breakfast, her movements calm, almost serene. The sight of her so at ease, so untouched by guilt, made John's stomach churn. How could she carry on as though nothing had happened? Did she feel no remorse for the devastation she had caused? As she sat down with her coffee, John couldn't hold back any longer. His voice, low but charged with restrained anger, cut through the silence. Who was he? Jennifer looked up, startled by the sharpness of his tone. For a fleeting moment, panic flickered in her eyes, before being replaced with a carefully measured calm. "Who are you talking about?" she asked, her voice casual, almost rehearsed. "The young man from last night," John growled, his gaze unrelenting. "The one you were with. Don't act like you don't know. I followed you." Her eyes widened briefly before narrowing again, her composure slipping for only a second. She took a deliberate sip of her coffee, setting the cup down with a sigh that grated on John's already frayed nerves. "John, it's not what you think," she said, her tone condescending, as if explaining something trivial. "It was harmless, just a little fun." "Fun?" John's voice rose, trembling with suppressed fury. "You call sneaking around behind my back with a man half your age fun? Do you even hear yourself?" Jennifer leaned back in her chair, exasperation written all over her face. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "We've been married for 30 years, John. People change. I've changed. Did you really think I'd stay the same forever?" The words struck John like a blow. "So what?" he demanded, his voice breaking with anger. "You're throwing everything away. Our family, our marriage, because you're bored, because you want excitement." She shrugged, her indifference slicing deeper than any confession could have. "I'm not throwing anything away," she replied, her tone infuriatingly nonchalant. "I'm just enjoying myself. Maybe you should try it." "Enjoying yourself?" John spat, bitterness thick in his voice. "At the expense of our family? What about our daughters, Jennifer? What about everything we built together?" Jennifer rolled her eyes. "They're adults, John. They'll understand. And let's be honest, this marriage hasn't been working for years. Maybe it's time we both moved on." John stared at her in disbelief. "Moved on?" he echoed, his voice raw with emotion. "You mean you're ready to throw away 30 years as if it meant nothing?" Her shrug was the final blow. "It doesn't have to be so dramatic. It was just a bit of fun, John. It doesn't have to mean anything." But to John, it meant everything. In that moment, the last fragile threads of his love for her snapped. For decades, he had sacrificed, compromised, and believed in their future. And now, she was telling him it had all been meaningless, a phase she was ready to leave behind. The fire of his anger cooled, solidifying into something hard and unyielding. Jennifer had made her choice. Now, John would make his. The following evening found John standing in a place he never thought he'd return to. The dimly lit bar where the reality of Jennifer's betrayal had first come crashing down on him. The flickering neon sign above the entrance cast an eerie glow on the pavement, making everything feel surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't escape. Lingering in the shadows, John replayed the events of the previous night in an endless loop, the sting of her infidelity fresh and raw. He had come here seeking clarity, a way to process the heartbreak, but all he found was the crushing weight of her deception, pressing harder, suffocating him. Inside, the bar hummed with its usual life, laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of chatter. To John, it was all meaningless noise, a distant murmur drowned out by the chaos in his mind. His eyes locked on Jennifer as she entered with the younger man, their closeness as glaring as a neon sign. They weren't even pretending anymore. No subtle glances or discreet gestures. Their bold, open affection twisted John's stomach. From the shadows, John watched as they slid into a booth near the back, the same booth they had occupied the night before. Drinks were ordered, laughter flowed freely, and their touches lingered with a warmth that once belonged to him. The dim lighting failed to hide the intimacy between them. Every small gesture, the way she leaned in, her hand brushing his arm, was another sharp sting, each more unbearable than the last. Time moved at a crawl, stretching endlessly as John stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away. He was trapped in his own private hell, torn between the overwhelming pain of her betrayal and the smoldering anger building inside him. Part of him begged to leave, to walk away before the fury inside consumed him entirely. But his legs refused to move. He stayed, a silent observer to his own destruction. Hours later, Jennifer and the man left the bar, their bodies still impossibly close. Jennifer's arm looped through his as if they were the only two people in the world. John followed, his breath shallow and ragged, his heart pounding with each step. They were too engrossed in each other to notice the shadow trailing behind them, too consumed by their own affair to care. Step by step, the distance between them and John closed, each stride fueled by fury and despair. Their aimless walk brought them to a secluded park. The crisp night air carried the faint scent of grass, the only sounds the rustling leaves and distant chirp of crickets. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the world itself had paused to witness this moment. John watched from the darkness as the younger man pulled Jennifer into his arms. Their bodies melded together, their whispers audible only to each other, though their meaning was painfully clear to John. Then came the words that shattered what little composure John had left. The man's voice, dripping with arrogance, cut through the stillness like a blade. "She's mine tonight, old man," he sneered, the taunt slicing deep. "We'll have a wild time until we've had our fill." Jennifer's laughter followed, light and dismissive, each note more cruel than the last. She turned toward John, her step slow and deliberate, her smirk a dagger to his already bleeding heart. With a condescending touch on his shoulder, she sealed the betrayal. "Don't worry, darling," she purred, her voice like venom laced with sugar. "I'll be back when I'm done." She turned away, her laughter echoing in the still night as she rejoined her lover. John stood frozen, paralyzed by the enormity of her betrayal. Her words, her actions, had severed the last fragile thread of hope he had clung to. As they disappeared into the shadows, something inside John snapped. A dark, final crack split through him, destroying what remained of the man he used to be. Where once there was love and sorrow, now there was only the cold fire of revenge. The days that followed blurred into a haze of anger and pain. John couldn't escape the images of Jennifer and her lover. Her laughter, the way her hand lingered on the younger man's arm, they haunted him, invading every waking moment, her mockery ringing in his ears. The weight of her betrayal became unbearable, hollowing him out until nothing remained but the growing need to make them pay. He went through the motions of life, but everything felt meaningless. Food tasted like ash, sleep was a distant memory, and work became a series of automatic tasks. His coworkers noticed the change, the dark circles under his eyes, the vacant look on his face, but no one dared to ask. John was unraveling, and it was visible to anyone who cared to look. Late one sleepless night, the idea took root, a dark, shocking thought that at first terrified him with its intensity. But as the days passed, that thought grew, taking shape until it became an unrelenting force. Jennifer thought she could mock him, dismiss their life together, and move on without consequences. She was wrong, terribly wrong. John began planning. His grief-fogged mind sharpened, now working with cold precision. He followed them obsessively, tracking their every move. He noted their favorite spots, their routines, the times they met. Each detail became a piece of a carefully constructed plan, his need for vengeance growing with each revelation. But watching wasn't enough. John knew he needed to be ready when the moment came. Crossing a line he never thought he would, he bought a gun. The transaction was disturbingly simple, the exchange of cash for cold steel in his hand surreal. Holding it felt like stepping into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. This was his reality now. At the range he practiced, the weight of the weapon in his hands a chilling reminder of his intentions. Each shot was a release, a promise of what was to come. He hid the gun away, waiting for the right moment, knowing it would arrive soon. The night came quicker than expected. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn. John followed them again, his heart no longer pounding with fear, but with grim determination. They walked hand in hand toward the hotel, their sanctuary of betrayal, their laughter floating on the breeze. But this time, John knew he wouldn't just stand by. This time, there was no turning back. John had remained in the shadows, his hand against the cold surface of the object that lay concealed under his coat. He silently waited until Jennifer and the younger man disappeared into the hotel. Then, with an almost deliberate carefulness, he followed. Dear listeners, we hope you're enjoying this story and the many others on our channel. If you like our content, we'd be delighted if you subscribe to our channel. For you, it's just a small click, but for us, it means the world and helps us create even more captivating stories. Thank you for being part of our journey. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of the story. With each step, a weight boiled inside him, an amalgam of emotions such as betrayal, heartbreak, and anger. The front desk clerk didn't even look up as he entered the hotel, too engrossed in whatever it was they were doing. John moved quietly, his focus narrowing to the number he had memorized in his head. The door was open a crack, and the muffled murmur of voices spilled into the corridor. His breathing quickened as he stood before the door, his mind racing through all that had brought him here. He thought about the betrayal of Jennifer, all those lies, and all the pain that had consumed him. A decision had been reached, and there was no going back now. Their laughter floated through the crack in the door, carefree and unguarded. The same laughter that once brought John joy now felt like a cruel mockery. He knocked, the sound echoing in the hallway like a prelude to what was to come. The door creaked open, and the younger man stood before him. In a split second, his facial expression changed from curious to puzzled. Before he could utter a word, John stepped inside with an intensity that startled both occupants. The younger man took a few steps backward as John filled the room. Jennifer was sitting on the bed. She turned around, her face pale as she saw him. "John!" she suddenly exclaimed, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" Her question just hung there in the air as John's face stayed set in hard lines, weighed down by what he felt. "You think you can do this to me?" he said in a low, strained tone. "You think nothing will happen?" The younger man raised his hands, stepping forward cautiously. "Let's talk about this," he said, his tone measured. "There's no need for this to get out of hand." Jennifer stood, panic flashing across her face. "Please, John, let's calm down and talk," she pleaded. "We can fix this." John's bitter laugh cut through the tension. "Fix it? There's nothing left to fix," he replied. "You've already made your choice." Thick tension filled the small room as emotions clashed in the air. John's words hung heavy in the air. His heartbreak and anger combined into a cold finality. Jennifer's pleas turned frantic, and the younger man tried once more to reason, but the damage had already been done. For John, there was no undoing what had been broken. The weight of the moment was crushing, yet he knew he had done what he had come for, to take from them everything which they had taken from him. Now, there was simply nothing left. Moments earlier, the room had been consumed by turmoil, panic coursing through the air, tension reaching its peak. Now, an eerie stillness had taken over, interrupted only by the soft, rhythmic sound of something dripping onto the floor. The heavy silence seemed almost alive, pressing down on John, making the walls feel as if they were closing in on him. For what felt like an eternity, John stood paralyzed. His mind reeled, struggling to process the enormity of what he'd done. He was numb, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of crossing a line that could never be undone. The weight of finality washed over him, relentless and unforgiving. It was irrevocable. Yet, through the haze of his shock, a chilling realization cut through. He needed to leave. Time was short. The police would arrive soon, and with them would come the crushing inevitability of justice, along with the unrelenting judgment for the blood on his hands. Shaking off his stupor, John moved with a calculated detachment. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a handkerchief and methodically wiped the gun, removing any trace of himself. Placing the weapon beside the bodies felt strangely conclusive, though it offered no sense of redemption. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, urging him forward. He couldn't afford to stay any longer. Without allowing himself a backward glance, John slipped out of the room, carefully closing the door behind him. The soft click reverberated through the hallway, amplified by the deafening quiet around him. His movements were brisk but deliberate, his heightened senses catching every sound, every shadow. Entering the hotel lobby, he forced his breathing to slow, his face a mask of calm indifference. The bustling staff carried on with their routines, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding above them. John crossed the lobby with precision, his expression unreadable, his pace measured to avoid suspicion. Exiting the building, he made his way to his car, parked several streets away. Despite his outward composure, his heart pounded relentlessly, and his mind raced ahead. There was no returning home. That place, once a sanctuary, was now irreparably stained by betrayal and blood. He knew what he had to do. Disappearing was the only way forward. Guided by instinct and grim determination, John drove aimlessly through the city for what felt like hours. The glowing streetlights blurred into streaks against the night sky, a fitting backdrop to his chaotic thoughts. Regret mingled with fear, but a cold resolve anchored him. The next steps were already forming in his mind. He turned onto a winding road leading out of the city, where thick forests consumed the surroundings and quiet solitude prevailed. Reaching a secluded area he had scoped out long ago, John pulled over and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath his feet as he moved further away from the remnants of his past life. This was all part of a contingency plan he had never thought he'd need, but had meticulously prepared for nonetheless. A secret account. A forged identity. Every detail was falling into place, as though this moment had always been inevitable. At the edge of the woods, John paused and cast one last look back at the road. It was a silent farewell to the life he was abandoning. With purpose in his stride, he headed for the nearest airport, his actions automatic, driven by necessity. Holding the forged passport in his hand felt surreal, a stark symbol of the new identity he was about to assume. He purchased a one-way ticket to a distant country, one where he could dissolve into anonymity and leave behind the wreckage of his former existence. As the plane roared down the runway and ascended into the night, John gazed out the window. The city lights below grew smaller, dimmer, until they vanished entirely. For the first time, the enormity of what he had done settled over him, a crushing burden that pressed against his chest. There was no undoing this. He had made his choice, and now he would carry it with him into an uncertain future, far from the life he once knew, far from the man he once was. John worked to adapt to the life he had carefully designed, one far removed from the wreckage of his past. Every trace of his former identity had been meticulously erased. His hair was now a different color, cropped short to replace the familiar style he'd worn for years. His once rugged face was clean-shaven, a stark contrast to the beard that had been his signature look. With a new name and a fabricated backstory, he settled in a small, secluded town hidden deep in the mountains of South America. It was the kind of place where outsiders went unnoticed and questions were seldom asked, just what he needed. The town's quiet nature mirrored John's desire for isolation. Its inhabitants kept to themselves, uninterested in probing into the lives of others. This suited John perfectly. He wasn't looking to form bonds or become part of the community. Instead, he kept busy as a handyman, repairing old houses scattered across the area. The physical labor filled his days, offering a temporary reprieve from the thoughts he worked so hard to suppress. On the surface, it seemed like an ideal sanctuary, but beneath the facade of his new existence, John's inner world was anything but peaceful. His mind churned with turmoil, haunted by the weight of his actions. The solitude of the town brought no comfort, especially when night fell and silence enveloped the area. In those quiet hours, he was left alone with his memories, unable to escape the past. The events of that fateful night played in his mind on an endless loop. The image of Jennifer's face, frozen in shock, lingered. The echo of gunfire resounded in his thoughts, refusing to fade. Even in his sleep, the nightmares pursued him, relentless and unyielding. His nights were restless. Staring at the cracked ceiling of his sparse room, John grappled with guilt that gnawed at him incessantly. The fleeting sense of justice he had felt in the aftermath of his actions had long dissipated, leaving behind only emptiness. In his anger, he had destroyed not just Jennifer's life, but his own as well. Everything they had once shared, the love, the dreams, the life they had built, had been obliterated in a single, irreversible moment. John threw himself into his daily routine, hoping to bury the memories beneath a facade of normalcy. Yet, no amount of work could silence the echoes of the past. His thoughts often drifted back to the life he had abandoned, the daughters he would never hold again, and the friends who would forever wonder about his fate. He had escaped the justice system, but there was no escaping the prison he had built within his own mind. In rare moments of reflection, John questioned whether redemption was possible. He had fled to avoid the legal consequences, but the true punishment was the relentless torment he carried within. The realization that he had crossed a line, allowing pain and anger to consume him, weighed on him like a crushing stone. No matter how far he ran, he couldn't outrun what he had become. Weeks turned into months, and John fell into the rhythm of his isolated existence. Yet, the guilt was ever present, an unrelenting reminder of the cost of his vengeance. He had lost everything: his family, his home, and the person he once was. Deep down, he understood that this was his true penance. He could evade the law, vanish from society, but he would never escape himself. Thank you for watching, and hope to see you soon. Have a great day.